afternoon. I've entitled it Simple Herbal Applications. We'll be looking at some simple herbs that probably all of you at least know about before and probably have used to some extent, but maybe you will learn some additional applications for these very common herbs actually. So we'll see how far we get today in the time that we have and see what we can gain. The one I'm going to start with first is cayenne, or also called African bird pepper. Some of its functions are that it stimulates circulation. It's a top first aid herb, stops bleeding, it's pain relieving, and is a liniment for itises. Itises such as arthritis and tendonitis and things like this. Usually these kind of things have a certain amount of pain that come along with it, especially arthritis will have pain and stiffness and swelling. Tendonitis will have a certain amount of pain usually, as well as inflammation of the tendon. So cayenne is good for that. It's also good for inflammations where there's swelling, redness, and pain. So a lot of these painful conditions, cayenne can be helpful. The form of usage is typically powder. That's the most common way that we use it. Other applications would be as a tincture. And you can even use it fresh, but that is definitely not the most common way of doing it. You can make your own fresh solution of it, especially if you have peppers and you need something really quick and you don't have the powder hanging around. It's great for first aid for heart attack and other emergencies. It's actually the herb of choice in these situations, whether or not you're having a heart attack or a stroke. And once you're having any kind of cardiovascular event, cayenne is a fantastic herb and would be most helpful in this situation. How you do this is administer the powder in the mouth or under the tongue or even on the tongue, followed by water. Or you put powder in a small amount of water, or as I said, if you don't have the powder and you do have some of the peppers hanging around, you can blend it up. The main thing at that point is just getting the cayenne into the person because it is an emergency situation. We had a personal experience with this some years ago as far as the effectiveness of cayenne in dealing with a heart attack situation or heart attack in process. We had gone on a hike. We tried to go on a church outing or hike every couple months or so. And a couple years ago, we went on a hike to a waterfall. It's 3.5 miles in and 3.5 miles out, 7 miles round trip. And so we got all on the trail and went along, and we got to the waterfall. Well, there was this lady that had decided to go on this outing at this particular time. She hadn't gone on a hike before, but she decided she wanted to go on this one. It's a bit heavy set, and okay, she was going to go for it and see how far she could go. So that's fine, okay, go as far as you want and turn around, that's no problem. Well, we got to the waterfall, most of us did, or pretty much all of us, and we sat down, enjoyed the waterfall, had our lunch, etc. The kids had some time to play, and we were ready to come back. And lo and behold, this lady shows up at the top of the hill above the waterfall. She had made it the 3.5 miles in. But everybody had been there for a while, so we were ready to go back. And it was getting a little later, so we did start to go back. And we had gone down the trail, and say a mile or so down the trail perhaps, there was this young runner that came up behind us, Pastor Herbert and myself, saying that this lady was having problems and we need to come. Well, typically on these hikes I do carry a little baggie of cayenne pepper. And so I sent it back with this young guy because he was young and energetic and willing to run. And so he went back and we followed quickly. When we got to the top of the waterfall, that's where she was flat out on a rock in very excruciating pain. And we had some other nurses that were there, and they were giving big pinchfuls of this in her mouth, followed by water from a bottle. And they would repeatedly do this every few minutes. And she was in a lot of pain. No, the pain was more along down the side here. And interestingly, about a month before that, we had lost another sister to a heart attack in the hospital with the very same pain. The people in the hospital didn't recognize, apparently, that it was a heart attack in process, because apparently females don't necessarily have the exact same symptoms as men do. It's almost, you think it's something's wrong with the spleen or something with maybe even this part of the colon, but it's not necessarily the chest pain or the arm pain. It's more of a side situation.
Heart attacks that occur in hospitals that are not diagnosed.
We saw it. It was a heart attack in process, this lady. The church had actually gone to see her, and she was in all this pain and nausea and vomiting. Well, she was not alive the next morning.
I had a heart attack at 41. I thought I had the flu. I had no chest pain whatsoever.
Wow, okay. So you do well with a little baggie of cayenne around. Anyway, as you'll see. So they were giving her these big pinches of cayenne followed by water. We managed to get a cell phone. Somebody had a cell phone, and we contacted 911. Well, we were 3.5 miles in. There were not roads nearby. So the emergency people got as close as they could with their vehicle. Then they got their four-wheeler and got as close as they could on their four-wheeler, cutting through the brush. And then at a point they had to leave that, and they walked in the rest of the way. Well, when they got there, all they did was take her blood pressure and give her some more water. And of course, they wouldn't let us give her any more cayenne. Well, their point is that cayenne is going to irritate the stomach. Well, if you're alive and you have an irritated stomach, that's great. If you're dead, you have nothing to worry about anyhow. So the better point, I think, is to have a little bit of an irritated stomach and be alive. Well, anyway, they took her blood pressure. They managed to start getting her up on her feet and help her to the four-wheeler. By the time she got to the four-wheeler, very slowly, she was doing a little better. At least she was not in such excruciating pain. Went up the hill with her on the four-wheeler, got her into the vehicle. By the time she was getting in the vehicle and sat down for a little bit, she was doing much better. Was not in the pain, was talking and so forth. And we took her, the vehicle took her to where all the other cars were parked in the trailhead parking lot. Well, she eventually went to the doctor the next day. She didn't even bother to go to the doctor that same day or emergency. And they said, oh, you were just dehydrated. I agree she was dehydrated. Most likely she was dehydrated, but it was not just a dehydrated situation. Her symptoms were very much like this other lady's. We had 2 or 3 RNs in the hiking group. We knew it was not just a dehydrated situation. But you see, they could not detect any symptoms from a heart attack, because what the cayenne does is it stimulates the circulation sufficiently so there is no tissue death in the heart muscle. So they can't detect the heart attack. They kept the circulation going. And she's still alive and well and with us today. Hasn't had any more problems. But that was a graphic experience of the power of cayenne in dealing with an emergency situation. So anytime you are encountering someone that has a potential heart attack or a stroke, this is definitely the thing to give them. Give them as much as they will take. And don't worry about it being hot. This is probably some of the hottest cayenne you can get. It's 160,000 heating units. And that's what she was getting. And I asked her later, did the cayenne seem hot? Because she got about a teaspoonful of this stuff in her mouth. That's a lot of cayenne, if maybe not even a little bit more. And she said no, she was in enough pain that the cayenne was just kind of all part of the environment, and it was not her problem at that point in time. She had cayenne, she said, in her hair and her clothes. She had cayenne all over, but in the process, she was not worrying about the heat of the cayenne. So you can keep that in mind too. Don't worry about somebody thinking that it's going to be hot. Actually, if they start to feel the cayenne hot, that's a good sign. They're starting to come around. So don't worry about it being too hot. And again, if you do give enough, that it starts to give them irritated stomach, we can deal with that later. We have aloe vera, we have slippery elm, even comfrey root. These are all very healing, soothing situations that can be helpful for an irritated stomach. But at least you have an irritated stomach to deal with. So if you have a family history of heart attack or stroke, or are predisposed to it for any reason, cayenne is a fantastic thing to keep around. Yes?
Can cayenne be just from a food store, or does it have to have a certain amount of food?
You can get it from the food store, especially like that's what you have access to. It's just that you'll need to use more, most likely. We gave her, this is probably about a teaspoon or so of this, so you just need to give more. Typical grocery store heating units for cayenne is about 40,000 compared to over 100,000. So you would just have to bump it up, but you could still get some good effects. And for many other things, anyhow, starting with the 40,000 is not bad necessarily, especially if you're not used to cayenne. The important thing, one of the important things is starting with what you are capable of as far as your dosage, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Cayenne's also good for shock or fainting. Again, the reason for that is it keeps your circulation going. It helps to normalize your circulation. When you are in a traumatic shock situation, whether it's physical or emotional, your circulation starts to become altered, and that's why you start to feel faint. That's why you start to have temperature irregularities maybe in your body. You go into shock because it's an altered circulatory condition that is happening, and cayenne will help to rectify that. So anytime you're in a trauma situation, whether or not you're actually involved in it, or you're tending to it, and you're finding yourself lightheaded or faint, cayenne can quickly get that rectified again so you can go on with a much clearer head and deal with the situation. Cayenne's good for bleeding wounds. You can sprinkle on a wound up to like a 1/16 of an inch. Now, depending on where the wound is, depending on how many nerve endings are in that particular area, it may sting a little. Like if it's in your fingers, where you have a lot of nerve endings, you'll probably feel that a bit more as opposed to some other area that does not have that number of nerve endings. But cayenne can be a very great herb for stopping bleeding. An alternative herb for that is comfrey root. Comfrey root can also be very good for stopping bleeding. Again, you just sprinkle the root directly on the wound, and it'll help to stop the bleeding. Both of those. Ground comfrey root herb. That is also very good. And if you have both comfrey root, dried comfrey root, and cayenne, you could sprinkle both of them, and the cayenne will probably potentize the comfrey a bit because it is what we call a carrier herb. Cayenne's also good for internal bleeding, for injury and ulcers. What you would do is either put in a little bit of water or put it in a little bit of juice and drink it. If a person is in a traumatic situation, again, at that point where there's internal bleeding, an accident or emergency, you'll be more intent on getting more in perhaps than you would on a regular situation. If a person has ulcers, then you have bleeding ulcers, that is, you have more of an opportunity to do a little bit over several times a day for a matter of days. Therefore, it's not such an emergency situation. And using the powder, you put a small amount in water or juice, or dry followed by water. The dry followed by water seems to be more applicable to an emergency situation. It's a little bit more pleasant to put the cayenne in some liquid before you drink it, as opposed to putting the powder directly on your in your mouth or tongue. You start with a very small amount and work up. And when we say a small amount, a little bit on the end of a spoon. If you're not used to things that are hot, you probably start with a